January 1946. The guns are silent. Across Europe, in muddy fields outside abandoned towns, steel still waits. Rows of tanks sit motionless beneath low winter clouds, their tracks half sunk into soil that has finally stopped shaking. Most are marked for scrap. Some already wear chalk numbers, counting down their final days. But not all of them. Among the twisted wreckage of a finished war, the Sherman tank remains strangely intact. Its paint is faded, its armor scarred, yet its engine still turns. Its turret still moves. Mechanics still climb inside, not to dismantle it but to prepare it for something next. The war that gave birth to this machine is over. Victory has been declared. Armies are shrinking. Budgets are tightening. New weapons are promised, sleeker and more powerful. And yet, across depots from Germany to the Pacific, the Sherman refuses to leave, not because it is feared, not because it is admired, but because it still fits a world struggling to move on. As nations attempt to rebuild from exhaustion and ruin, this tank remains quietly waiting for another call it was never meant to answer. That waiting leads directly into the world the Sherman would face after victory was declared. By the summer of 1945, the war that had consumed entire continents finally stopped demanding new sacrifices. Germany lay divided and devastated. Japan surrendered under the weight of atomic fire and naval blockade. Across Europe and Asia, cities were shattered, rail lines twisted, factories hollowed out by bombing or stripped bare in retreat. Victory did not bring relief so much as exhaustion. The armies that had grown to unprecedented size now faced an unfamiliar order. Stand down. Millions of soldiers were demobilized in months. Governments that had poured every resource into survival suddenly confronted empty treasuries and restless populations, desperate for food, housing, and work. War production lines slowed or stopped entirely. Tanks that once rolled straight from factories to front lines now sat idle in vast storage parks. The expectation was simple. Wartime weapons would vanish. Tanks would be melted down. Guns would be scrapped. The future, it was said, belonged to new designs shaped by the lessons of total war. But the world in 1945 was not a clean slate. It was a fractured landscape of power vacuums, unresolved tensions, and fragile peace. Across Eastern Europe, the Red Army did not withdraw. In Asia, civil wars reignited almost immediately. Former colonies pressed for independence, often violently. The alliance that had defeated the Axis powers fractured within months, replaced by suspicion, ideological rivalry, and the early outlines of what would soon be called the Cold War. This was not a world at rest. It was a world holding its breath. Militaries, especially those outside the United States, faced a harsh reality. They could not afford to rebuild from nothing. New tank programs required years of development, testing, and industrial recovery luxuries few nations possessed. Steel was scarce. Fuel was rationed. Skilled labor had been lost to the war or redirected to civilian reconstruction. Even victorious powers were constrained. Britain emerged triumphant but financially crippled. France had to rebuild its army almost from scratch while repairing cities and infrastructure. Smaller nations, newly liberated or newly formed, had security concerns, but no industrial base to support modern armored forces. In this environment, surplus became strategy. The United States alone had produced tens of thousands of tanks during the war. The majority of them Shermans. They filled depots across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They came with spare parts, trained crews, maintenance manuals, and an entire logistical ecosystem that already existed. To discard them would require money, time, and effort. To keep them required almost none. At the same time, the nature of warfare itself was uncertain. Nuclear weapons promised a future where tanks might become irrelevant overnight. Jet aircraft hinted at a battlefield dominated by speed and altitude. Military planners hesitated, unsure whether to invest in revolutionary designs or wait to see which lessons of the war would truly endure. So, armies paused. They kept what they had. The Sherman once a symbol of American industrial power, quietly became a placeholder for the unknown future. It was not cutting-edge anymore. Its limitations were well documented, but it was available, understood, and already paid for. For nations rebuilding under pressure, that mattered more than theoretical superiority. Security concerns only intensified the problem. Borders shifted. New alliances formed and collapsed. Internal unrest threatened fragile governments. The idea of fully disarming, even temporarily, felt dangerous. Tanks, even older ones, offered reassurance, deterrence, and a visible sign of authority. In many cases, the Sherman became the only realistic option. It could be crewed by veterans who already knew its systems. It could be repaired with existing tools. It could operate on fuel grades and infrastructure that survived the war. It did not demand a leap into untested technology. The post-war world did not choose the Sherman out of nostalgia. It chose it out of necessity, and as global tensions quietly hardened, the question was no longer whether the Sherman would disappear, but how long it could continue to adapt to a world that no longer resembled the one it was built to fight in. That question leads directly into what the Sherman truly was beneath its wartime reputation. To understand why the Sherman endured, it is necessary to strip away the myths that formed around it during the war. By 1945, the tank already carried a reputation shaped by comparison often unfavorable against heavier German designs. Yet that reputation obscured the reality of what the Sherman had been built to do. The M4 Sherman was never conceived as a singular battlefield champion. It was designed as a component within a much larger system. American armored doctrine emphasized mobility, coordination, and sustained operations over individual tank superiority. The Sherman reflected that philosophy in every line of its construction. From the beginning, standardization mattered more than The Sherman's dimensions were chosen to fit existing rail cars and transport ships. Its weight was kept within limits that allowed it to cross most bridges without reinforcement. Its engine options, whether radial, diesel, or automotive, were selected based on availability and production capacity, not prestige. This flexibility meant factories could continue building tanks even when specific components were scarce. Equally important was reliability. The Sherman's drivetrain and suspension were engineered to survive long-distance movement with minimal maintenance. During the war, it routinely traveled hundreds of kilometers under its own power, something many heavier tanks struggled to achieve. Breakdowns did occur, but repairs were usually straightforward. Crews could replace damaged parts in the field using tools they already possessed. The tank's internal layout reflected a similar pragmatism. Controls were relatively intuitive. Visibility, while limited by modern standards, was better than many contemporaries. Crew positions were standardized across variants, reducing retraining time. For armies suddenly trying to rebuild their forces in 1946 and 1947, this mattered enormously. The Sherman's true strength, however, lay beyond the vehicle itself. It existed within a logistical framework that had already proven capable of sustaining global war. Spare parts were abundant, ammunition was standardized and widely produced. Manuals were translated, distributed, and tested under combat conditions. Training programs had been refined across multiple theaters of war. No other tank emerged from the conflict with such a complete support structure intact. This meant the Sherman could be absorbed by foreign armies with minimal friction. Crews trained on one variant could adapt quickly to another. Mechanics familiar with civilian engines often found the tank's systems understandable. Even nations with limited industrial capacity could keep Shermans running using cannibalization and basic machine work. Adaptability extended to firepower as well. While early Shermans carried the 75mm gun, optimized for infantry support, later versions introduced higher-velocity weapons, improved armor layouts, and specialized variants. Recovery vehicles, flamethrower tanks, and command platforms all shared the same basic chassis. This modularity made post-war upgrades feasible without starting from scratch. Critically, the Sherman was forgiving. It tolerated poor roads, inconsistent fuel quality, and harsh climates. It functioned in deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen plains. It did not demand ideal conditions to operate effectively. For nations facing internal unrest or uncertain borders, this flexibility outweighed theoretical combat performance. The tank's limitations were real. Its armor could be penetrated by newer anti-tank weapons. Its silhouette was tall, its protection lagged behind emerging designs. But in the immediate post-war years, the Sherman's weaknesses were predictable, and predictable problems were easier to manage than unknown ones. In a period defined by hesitation and uncertainty, the Sherman offered something rare: stability. It was a machine whose behavior was known. Its costs were sunk. Its risks were calculable. While planners debated the future of armored warfare, the Sherman quietly continued to meet the demands of the present. That reliability, spread across dozens of nations and thousands of vehicles, set the stage for the many different ways the Sherman would be judged, not by a single battlefield, but through multiple lenses that reveal why it refused to disappear. For the men who climbed into the Sherman after 1945, familiarity mattered more than reputation. Many were veterans returning to service, not out of ambition, but obligation. They had survived the war inside this machine. They knew its sounds, its smells, its habits. They knew how the engine felt when it was healthy and when something was about to fail. In an uncertain post-war world, that knowledge was reassuring. Training new crews on the Sherman required less time than introducing unfamiliar platforms. Muscle memory carried over. Procedures were already internalized. Even younger recruits learned faster because their instructors spoke from experience rather than theory. In countries rebuilding under pressure, that efficiency saved months, sometimes years. Survivability also played a quiet role. While the Sherman's armor had limits, its internal layout and escape options had been refined through combat. Crews trusted that if something went wrong, they understood how to get out alive. That trust reduced hesitation, especially during internal security operations and early Cold War deployments, where uncertainty, not overwhelming force, defined the threat. The Sherman became a bridge between generations of soldiers, those shaped by World War and those entering service in its shadow. That continuity kept it alive long after its wartime purpose ended. That human trust flowed directly into the economic realities shaping post-war armies. In 1946, budgets dictated strategy more than doctrine. Most nations emerging from the war were financially exhausted. Currency reserves were depleted. Infrastructure demanded immediate investment. Armies competed with civilian needs for steel, fuel, and labor. In that environment, developing a new tank fleet was not just expensive, it was politically untenable. The Sherman offered a solution without requiring debate. Thousands of vehicles already existed. Many were transferred through military aid programs, often at minimal cost. Spare parts were included. Training assistance followed. For governments trying to maintain security while rebuilding economies, the choice was straightforward. Operating costs were predictable. Maintenance schedules were known. Fuel consumption, while significant, fit existing supply chains. Even storage was simpler, as facilities already existed to house and service the vehicles. In contrast, abandoning the Sherman meant committing to uncertain expenses and long time. New designs required factories that no longer existed. Testing programs demanded funding that could not be spared. The economic argument alone ensured the tank's survival well into the post-war decade. The financial logic reinforced another advantage, one rooted not in money, but in engineering. The Sherman's design did not resist change. It absorbed it. Its chassis supported a wide range of modifications without structural redesign. Guns were replaced, armor was reinforced or reconfigured. Communications equipment was updated. Suspension systems were improved incrementally rather than replaced entirely. This allowed the Sherman to evolve alongside emerging threats. Anti-tank weapons improved, and so did protective measures. Firepower increased through incremental upgrades rather than radical leaps. Each improvement extended service life without disrupting training or logistics. Crucially, these upgrades could be implemented locally. Nations modified Shermans to suit regional needs, climates, and tactical doctrines. The tank became a platform rather than a finished product. That adaptability ensured it remained relevant not because it was modern but because it could be made sufficient, again and again. As these perspectives converged, the Sherman's survival began to shape global strategy itself. drawing it into larger geopolitical forces that would test it far beyond the war it was built to fight. As the wartime alliance fractured, the Sherman found itself drawn into a new kind of conflict, one defined less by declared wars and more by pressure, presence, and influence. The early Cold War reshaped how military power was distributed, and the Sherman became one of its most visible instruments. The United States emerged from the war with unmatched industrial capacity and vast stockpiles of equipment. Supplying allies became a strategic tool. Tanks were no longer just weapons. They were symbols of alignment. Nations receiving Shermans were often stepping into an American-led security framework, whether formally or informally. Across Western Europe, rearming quickly mattered. The threat was no longer distant. Borders felt temporary. The Sherman allowed armies to field armored units immediately, even while longer-term modernization plans remained unresolved. In Asia and the Middle East, newly formed or reconstituted states faced internal instability and external pressure simultaneously. Shermans filled gaps where no alternatives existed. Unlike newer tanks tied to national production lines, the Sherman traveled easily across political boundaries. Its widespread use created a shared baseline of armored capability among allied states. Training exchanges, maintenance assistance, and doctrine flowed along the same routes as the vehicles themselves. The tank's global presence turned it into a constant appearing wherever influence was contested, but full-scale war was still avoided. That visibility ensured it remained part of strategic calculations far beyond its original design intent. Yet this global reach also meant the Sherman would be judged not only by those who used it, but by those who faced it. For opponents encountering the Sherman after 1945, its presence carried a different meaning. It was not feared as a technological marvel. Instead, it represented persistence in conflicts. Where adversaries expected post-war demilitarization, the sight of familiar armored silhouettes was unsettling. The war, it seemed, had never fully ended. The Sherman became a reminder that old tools could still enforce new realities. Enemy forces quickly recognized its strengths and limitations. They adapted accordingly, just as they had during the war. Anti-tank tactics emphasized ambush, terrain, and numbers rather than direct confrontation. But familiarity cut both ways. The Sherman's predictable behavior also meant its crews understood these threats intimately. This mutual understanding reduced surprise but increased intensity. Engagements involving Shermans after the war were rarely accidental. They were deliberate, calculated, and often symbolic tests of resolve rather than sheer firepower. The tank's continued use blurred the line between wartime and peacetime conflict. It made restraint visible, but force undeniable. That tension fed directly into deeper questions about military doctrine and moral choice. The Sherman's survival challenged a fundamental assumption of military thinking that superiority must always be technological. Post-war planners faced a dilemma: pursue perfection at high cost, or accept adequacy at scale. The Sherman embodied the latter choice. It was not the strongest, fastest, or most heavily armored, but it was sufficient, available, and controllable. This choice carried moral weight. Fielding older equipment reduced the likelihood of catastrophic escalation. It allowed states to assert control without immediately provoking arms races. The Sherman became a tool for stability as much as combat. At the same time, reliance on an aging platform forced hard decisions about risk. Crews accepted limitations in exchange for reliability. Commanders balanced capability against restraint. These compromises defined early Cold War armored doctrine more than any single technological breakthrough. The Sherman endured because it aligned with a world seeking order without ignition power, without provocation. But history would soon test that balance. In one conflict in particular, the Sherman would be called back into frontline combat, not as a symbol, but as a necessity, revealing whether its long survival could withstand the pressures of a new kind of war. June 1950. The illusion of post-war stability collapsed on the Korean Peninsula. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the conflict escalated with stunning speed. What began as a regional clash immediately drew in global powers, transforming Korea into the first true battlefield of the Cold War. For the United States and its allies, the problem was immediate and stark. There were not enough modern armored units available to respond. The Second World War had ended only 5 years earlier, but much of the American armored force had been reduced, mothballed, or reassigned. New tank designs existed largely on paper. Production lines had slowed or shut down. The assumption that future wars would look entirely different had left armies unprepared for a sudden conventional conflict. And so, the Sherman returned. From storage depots in Japan and the continental United States, M4 Shermans were pulled back into service. Crews retrained, engines were overhauled. Guns were recalibrated. In Mani Casas, the tanks sent to Korea were nearly identical to those that had fought in Europe and the Pacific. For soldiers arriving on the peninsula, the sight was both familiar and unsettling. The terrain was harsh mountainous, narrow, unforgiving. Roads were poor. Weather shifted violently between extremes. Against newer Soviet-designed T-3-485, tanks fielded by North Korean forces, the Sherman appeared outmatched on paper. Yet war rarely unfolds on paper. The Sherman's reliability proved decisive in the opening months. While heavier tanks struggled with mechanical failures and supply issues, Shermans reached the front. They crossed bridges others could not. They were repaired under fire. They supported infantry in desperate defensive actions that slowed the North Korean advance. In July 1950, American and South Korean units fought delaying battles across southern Korea. Armor was scarce. Every functioning tank mattered. Shermans, often operating in small numbers, provided mobile firepower where none should have existed. Their presence stabilized collapsing lines long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The tank's limitations were undeniable. Its armor was vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons. Its guns struggled against the frontal protection of the T-3-485 in direct engagements. Losses mounted. Crews paid the price for relying on a design born of a different war. But the Sherman did not fail in the role demanded of it at Buhat time. As United Nations forces regrouped, heavier tanks were rushed to the theater. Newer designs began to appear. But it was the Sherman that carried the burden of the war's opening phase, bridging the gap between demobilization and full mobilization. Its return shattered assumptions. The idea that World War II equipment had no place in modern conflict proved dangerously optimistic. The Sherman demonstrated the reliability, logistics and availability could outweigh raw specifications when war arrived unexpectedly. The Korean War forced military planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. The future had arrived faster than preparation allowed, and as the conflict intensified, the Sherman would not simply endure it, would adapt again. Reshaped under fire to meet demands it was never designed to face, that adaptation would define the second turning point in its long post-war life. The return of the Sherman to combat did not mark a final stand. It marked a transformation as the Korean War stabilized into a grinding conflict of movement and counter-movement. The shortcomings of existing armored equipment became impossible to ignore. Shermans that had survived the war's opening months were already being modified. Lessons were applied in real time, driven by necessity rather than doctrine. Firepower came first. Variants equipped with higher velocity guns were introduced to counter improved armor threats. Ammunition types expanded. Crews learned to exploit terrain, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated infantry support to offset disadvantages in head-on engagements. The Sherman was no longer expected to dominate it, was expected to function. Protection followed. Additional armor plating was welded on where possible. Sandbags, steel plates, and improvised measures appeared, not as symbols of desperation, but of adaptation. The tank's structure tolerated these changes without catastrophic stress. It remained mobile. It remained serviceable. Communications upgrades also played a critical role. Improved radios reinforced the Sherman's original strength, coordination. In the chaotic environment of Cold War-era battlefields, the ability to direct fire, call support, and adjust tactics in real time mattered as much as armor thickness. Beyond Korea, similar patterns emerged worldwide. Nations operating Shermans modified them to fit regional needs. Some focused on improved anti-armor capability. Others emphasized infantry support or internal security roles. The tank became a canvas onto which local doctrine was applied. This reinvention extended service life, not by denying obsolescence but by managing it. The Sherman did not attempt to compete with emerging main battle tanks. It filled gaps. It reinforced second-line units. It provided armored presence where newer systems were unavailable or unnecessary. In doing so, it avoided replacement by remaining useful rather than exceptional. The tank's continued presence influenced design philosophy. Military planners began to reconsider assumptions about rapid technological turnover. Durability, upgrade potential, and logistical depth gained renewed importance in armored doctrine discussions. The Sherman's transformation also reshaped how Allies perceived American military support. Equipment delivered was not static. It evolved alongside operational realities. That flexibility strengthened partnerships and extended the tank's geopolitical relevance. By the mid-1950s, the Sherman was no longer a frontline standard in major powers, but it was far from gone. Its silhouette still appeared in training grounds, border patrols, and regional conflicts. Each appearance reinforced a lesson learned under fire. Survival in warfare depends as much on adaptability as innovation. As newer tanks gradually assumed primary roles, the Sherman shifted quietly into the background, still active, still counted, still relied upon. The consequences of that endurance would unfold over decades, shaping military forces long after the sound of its engine faded from major battlefields. Those consequences define the aftermath of a tank that refused to vanish. By the late 1950s, the Sherman had officially passed its peak. Newer tanks dominated procurement plans. Doctrinal focus shifted toward heavier armor, higher caliber guns, and integrated battlefield systems shaped by Cold War expectations. On paper, the Sherman belonged to history. In reality, it remained everywhere, across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Shermans continue to operate in roles both visible and quiet. Some served in frontline units of smaller nations with limited access to modern equipment. Others were reassigned to reserve formations, training schools, and internal security forces. Many became the backbone of armored capability for armies still defining their strategic identity. This persistence was not accidental. The Sherman's logistical footprint had become self-sustaining. Spare parts circulated through international markets. Mechanics trained on the platform passed their knowledge to new generations. Entire maintenance ecosystems evolved around keeping the tank operational long after manufacturers moved on. In some countries, Shermans were upgraded repeatedly rather than replaced. Guns were swapped, fire control systems were improved, engines were refurbished or replaced entirely. These modifications did not aim to make the Sherman cut. They aimed to keep it relevant within specific operational limits. The tank also found new life in non-traditional roles. Engineering variants cleared obstacles and repaired roads. Recovery vehicles salvaged damaged equipment. Command versions coordinated units in environments where armored mobility still mattered more than protection. Politically, the Sherman's continued service allowed governments to project stability without provoking escalation. Deploying older armor sent a signal of preparedness without aggressive modernization. In regions where tensions simmered but open war was avoided, that balance mattered. Even when Shermans were finally withdrawn from active service, they were rarely discarded. Many were stored, sold, or transferred again. Each transfer extended their lifespan and spread their influence further. By the time most major powers retired the Sherman entirely, it had outlasted several generations of supposedly superior designs. Its endurance rewrote assumptions about how long a wartime machine could remain useful. Yet endurance alone does not explain impact. To understand what the Sherman truly left behind, its long service must be measured not in years, but in consequences. Those consequences define the second phase of its aftermath. The Sherman's long service life reshaped more than inventories. It reshaped expectations. For military planners observing its endurance, the lesson was not that old equipment should be preserved indefinitely, but that longevity itself could be a strategic asset. The Sherman demonstrated that a platform designed with flexibility and logistical depth could remain relevant long after its original battlefield context vanished. This realization influenced post-war armored doctrine in subtle but lasting ways. Designers began to prioritize upgrade potential over perfection. Chassis life cycles were extended. Modular systems became more common. The idea that a tank must be replaced entirely every decade lost some of its appeal. The Sherman also altered how military aid was understood. Supplying equipment was no longer just about immediate capability. It was about sustainability. Nations receiving Shermans did not simply gain armored units. They inherited a system that could be maintained, adapted, and integrated over time. That approach informed later aid programs, shaping alliances through shared logistics rather than shared technology alone. On the battlefield, the Sherman's impact was quieter but profound. It normalized the presence of armored vehicles in conflicts that might otherwise have lacked them entirely. This shifted power balances within regions, sometimes stabilizing fragile states, sometimes hardening divisions. In either case, the tank's influence extended beyond its firepower. There were limits to this legacy. The Sherman could not keep pace indefinitely. As anti-tank weapons advanced and battlefields grew more complex, its vulnerabilities became impossible to ignore. Eventually, even the most adaptable design reaches the edge of usefulness. But by the time the Sherman finally faded from service, it had already achieved something rare. It had bridged eras. It connected total war to Cold War, industrial mobilization to limited conflict, victory to uneasy peace. The tank's story became a case study taught not for its combat statistics, but for its end. It reminded planners that wars are not fought by ideal machines, but by available ones. That understanding lingers long after the Sherman's engines stopped turning, guiding decisions in an age still defined by uncertainty. And it leads naturally to the final question: this machine leaves behind what its survival ultimately meant. The Sherman tank was never meant to be remembered this way. It was designed for a war that demanded speed, numbers, and reliability, not longevity. Its creators did not expect it to outlive the conflict that defined it, nor to serve as a bridge between one global order and the next. And yet, when the world emerged from war uncertain and fractured, the Sherman remained. Its survival was not a triumph of firepower or armor. It was a triumph of suitability. In a world struggling to rebuild, the Sherman answered practical needs rather than theoretical ones. It moved when roads were broken. It fought when newer weapons were unavailable. It endured because it fit the moment repeatedly, even as that moment kept changing. The lesson it leaves behind is uncomfortable but enduring. Progress in warfare is not always driven by the best idea, but by the one that can be sustained. Reliability can outweigh innovation. Familiarity can shape outcomes as powerfully as superiority. The Sherman reminds us that history does not retire machines when wars end. It keeps what still works. It reuses what can adapt. And sometimes it allows an ordinary design to shape extraordinary decades simply by refusing to disappear. In that quiet persistence, the Sherman found its place not as the most feared tank of its time, but as one of the most consequential, and in the long shadow of the war that created it. That may be the most enduring legacy of all.